So part two of our premier partner spotlight with the Berkeley Group on utility scale solar. I want to focus on the legislative and regulatory framework for approving applications in Virginia, particularly as Michael, as you see it at the local level. You know, we at VACO, we follow all the policy and legislation at the state level, but you're on the ground seeing how this plays out. So the first question is, you know, what are the steps that a developer has to take in terms of federal, state, and local approval before breaking ground? Sometimes it can be quite a lengthy process and very involved.
Yeah, sure. So I think I'll start at the local level. Commonly, localities are allowing this use only through a use permit, whether that's a conditional use permit or a special use permit, or in some cases, special exception. But other localities have established specific zoning districts or overlay districts where it may be necessary to rezone property as well, in conjunction maybe with a use permit. So we do see that. And I spoke earlier about the 15.2-2232 regulations, statutes that would require, as a public utility, require a locality, principally the Planning Commission, to determine whether or not a project is in accord with a comprehensive plan for that locality. Beyond the use permit stage, it's going to be local permitting, site plan review, building permitting, and other trades permits that may be associated with the project. Certainly leading from that, most of the localities that we work with, their stormwater permitting is administered by the state, so they would certainly need those permits from DEQ and those reviews. Beyond that, at a state level review, projects that are 150 megawatts or less, they would follow the Department of Environmental Quality's permit by rule process. And there's maybe a slightly less stringent permit by rule PBR process for projects under 5 megawatts. And then projects that are greater than 150 megawatts, they're reviewed by the State Corporation Commission. Of course, from a state side, VDOT is heavily involved in projects. The review of those projects, certainly whether there's ingress, egress points along state maintained roads, and certainly impacts to those roads, as I spoke to, and the locality. I would strongly encourage localities, if they're not already, to coordinate with VDOT in the review of the projects, and certainly with DEQ as well. In terms of federal level review, occasionally we'll see projects needing to get FAA, preliminary review or some type of cursory review, depending on the proximity to them of those to an airport. I think the most common federal review would be through the Corps of Engineers for potential impacts to wetlands. We do see projects quite often. I think most of the time projects are doing a great job of designing to avoid wetlands and the like. We do have some best practices that we recommend in terms of the proximity of active development from wetlands, that we would recommend something more stringent in terms of a distance than would commonly be required. But even still, we do see projects that are either making use of existing stream crossings. You may have a farm or forested site that has an existing stream or wetland crossing, and they want to continue to utilize that, ideally improving the condition of that, or they're actually proposing new crossings, just given the layout of a project, and they may desire to get to a certain area, certain open area of a site, and have an internal roadway that they wish to cross a stream. So certainly you're going to have Corps of Engineers involvement on that. Kind of maybe beyond the government review directly, you also have coordination with PJM Interconnection LLC, or what everyone commonly refers to as PJM. This is the regional transmission organization that serves the entirety of Virginia, along with parts of Delaware, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Maryland, Michigan, New Jersey, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, West Virginia, and DC. It is regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, and essentially electrical companies within the PJM territory are members of PJM, and PJM manages the transmission network. So generation projects ultimately need to receive an interconnection agreement through PJM to connect and transmit generated electricity to the grid. And at least since 2022, there's been quite a backlog because of the number of renewable energy projects within PJM's territory, certainly a lot of those in Virginia. And there's a queue for applying to that interconnection review. PJM is going to be looking at the project and certainly the design of that project and the capacity of the transmission network that it's going to be connecting into. And we are not directly involved in that review, and I would tell you every week I learn more about all of this. And at the last meeting I was at, I learned more about the PJM process in terms of, I think we already knew about sometimes the length of time that this can take. And when, a project that we are currently reviewing for use permit has apparently been in the queue for 6 years and still does not yet have their interconnection agreement. But PJM is looking again at the capacity of that grid and perhaps evaluating multiple projects that are feeding into that same relatively local transmission network, and how it what other what the capacity is, what improvements may need to take place. I think there's some degree of evaluation of the viability of a project to perform upgrades that may be necessary to the grid network. So there is a lot involved with the PJM process as well. It may, in some ways, it does relate to the local evaluation of a project. We would not expect a project to have an interconnection agreement through PJM yet at the use permit review stage. Certainly, there would be a need for that project, or an expectation for that project, to have actually construction permits at the local level to have the PJM interconnection. They're not going to proceed to construction without it. Mm-hmm. So it's a timely or a lengthy process that's important for a locality to understand perhaps where a project stands in that process, because it may dictate when it can actually be constructed, or will dictate when it can actually be constructed.
That's helpful, because I think in terms of when you do a special use permit, a lot of times what we see, whether in an ordinance or in the special use permit application it'll say, it'll have a condition such as must begin, construction by a certain date, 2-3 years, or have a final site plan submitted. And if you're in the backlog of PJM, and you could run afoul of some of that. So it kind of is, that's important, I think, for both the developer and the locality to have that discussion, it sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely. And you hit on something that's always a challenge, regardless of what the project is, but it's tracking the effective date of a project. And I think with what we've seen, certainly and I've seen this in multiple different states, with extending out permit effectiveness. And with COVID, we certainly have seen that. In other states, I've seen it, to ensure that housing related permits, let's say, have an extended time horizon. That can be difficult to track it, locally. It's something that it needs to be administered locally, and needs to, you need to have a good platform to ensure that, this permit that was issued 3 years ago or 5 years ago is still in effect, and making sure that you're keeping track of that, and knowing kind of the inventory of eligible projects and projects that may be close to expiring.
Yeah, it's important. So switching gears a little bit, and you and I have talked about this during the last legislative session. There were several bills that would have impacted local land use authority, according for the siting of utility scale solar and battery. And really, the genesis of these bills is proponents were saying, hey, look, the Virginia General Assembly passed the Virginia Clean Economy Act in 2020. It mandates going to renewable resources. And it even dictates certain megawatts in the different service territories. Although these bills did not pass, and VACO was heavily involved in opposition because we really wanted to preserve a lot of what we talked about, which is the local decision-making authority. I know you were looking at those legislations. How would they have impacted the local review process from what you're seeing at the local level?
Sure. So our major focus was on HB 636 and its companion SB 567. And then beyond that, there was also SB 697. So the first two bills, as we understood them, they would apply to projects with a rated generation capacity of 50 megawatts or more. They would also apply to wind projects of 100 megawatts or more and energy storage of 50 megawatts or more. So the original 50 megawatts, that's for utility scale solar. They would have required localities to establish a compatible ordinance that provides for the development of these types of energy facilities within the locality. The requirements of those would have been established within the Virginia statutes, meaning that local ordinances could not be more restrictive than what was established in statutes under the law. A local governing body would be considered not to have a compatible renewable energy ordinance if it has a moratorium on development of facilities. And that we interpreted that to mean that localities cannot simply prohibit the use even without a moratorium, that they would have to allow for solar facilities 50 megawatts and greater, battery energy storage of 50 megawatts or greater, and wind of 100 megawatts or more. And it's important to point out, this would have applied to every locality in Virginia. And maybe there was and Joe, you may know this, maybe there was a carve out that it was applicable only to counties rather than cities and towns, but at some stage it applied to every jurisdiction in every locality. It did establish that if the locality fails to act on an application within a specified time, or if it denied the application, then the applicant could apply for approval from the State Corporation Commission. And that if the SCC approves the application, then it shall be exempt from obtaining approvals or permits, including land use approvals or permits under the regulation and ordinances of the host locality. It did also that those bills would have modified the current law regarding the host siting agreement as well, that an applicant must seek when proposing a utility scale or battery energy storage facility. So that would have been an interesting impact. On one hand, I think having some clear criteria would not be a terrible thing, but I think, as a planner, as someone who's worked in local government, I do believe and respect local land use authority. And, I think we certainly encourage the localities that we work with to have as I talked about, a clear policy where these uses are allowed and where they may be less desirable. Today, I think in talking to localities, I think it's a fair conversation for them to talk about whether this use is something they wish to have in their locality. Not every locality is expected to be able to allow for wind turbines, and they should simultaneously not be expected to allow for solar if that's something that they desire. And they may have competing land uses. They may be seeing growth that or the need for growth that utility scale solar of a certain size, scale, and location may curtail that opportunity for growth that they need, whether that's residentially or commercially. So I think these bills certainly would have curtailed those two bills, those companion bills would have certainly curtailed the locality's ability to do that. Then we had SB 697. And this was an interesting bill. Basically, and I'll read exactly a provision from this bill. So basically, it would have changed 15.2-2288.7, local regulation of solar facilities, by adding a subpart G that indicated that no local ordinance shall include: one, limits on the total amount, density, or size of any ground-mounted solar facility or energy facility until such time that the total area under panels within the locality exceeds 4% of the total area within the locality. Or two, any prohibitions on the use of solar panels that comply with the generally accepted national environmental protection and product safety standards, such as those set forth in subsection A13 of 15.2-2286. Technically, the provisions of the subsection shall not apply to any site that was the subject of an application to construct a solar facility or energy storage facility submitted to a locality before July 1st, 2024. And it established that nothing in the subsection shall require a locality to approve an application for solar or energy storage projects, or limit a locality's authority to establish criteria and requirements for siting, including those related to tree canopy and stormwater management. So that particular bill, while it would have established statutes that didn't prohibit a locality from denying projects, or didn't create an expectation that a denied project could be approved by some other authority, it would have tied the hands of localities to restrict the use in a lot of sweeping ways, in my opinion. So on its face, it would have said, well, you can't locate, or you can't regulate the total amount or density or size of facilities until your community has 4% or more under coverage. But I don't know if it was the intent for that to explicitly disallow localities from allowing the use in one zoning district but not in other zoning districts, for instance, because that by its nature restricts the area of a use of any uses that can be developed within a particular locality. So that was one question that we had, whether it would go so far as to say, well, you now have to allow this use in every zoning district within your locality. I don't know that that was the intent. I didn't hear that that was the intent, but it would be important to clarify that within any proposed legislation. So yeah, I think, and we did have some other points of concern with that, and we heard from some of our client localities as well, questioning, well, what if our locality has permitted, let's say 2% of their land area or 3% of their land area up until this point? Would that not be counted towards that 4%? Or would the land area only approved after, in this case, July 1st of 2024, qualify to meeting that 4%? So we have to provide 4% on top of everything that we've already permitted. Again, I do big supporter of local land use authority and regulation, certainly in Virginia, enabled through the state statutes. But as we've heard when these bills were coming through, at least Dominion officials have come out and said that they don't see any problem in advancing projects at the local level, that they've not encountered the challenges that these bills seem to work to resolve. I always would encourage, if there's a perceived need for this type of legislation, then have conversations with the localities, understand what their objections and concerns are. And I think a lot of localities, while supportive of the goals and objectives of the Virginia Clean Economy Act, in a lot of cases, they are perceiving that they're having to provide electrical generation to meet the demand outside of their areas. And I think, is that a reasonable expectation? and especially is it a reasonable expectation if they're mandated to provide for that? So I think there's a lot of interesting conversations to be had.
Yeah, part of what those bills, well, technically they didn't pass. They were
Correct,
carried
right.
over for the year and to go to the Commission on Electric Utility Regulation. So they're coming back, right? As we like to say in the legislature for the 2025 session. So are you hearing anything from localities or developers about what they would or would not want legislation to do if something were to come forward in the 2025 session or thereafter?
At this point, not yet. I think a lot of our clients are certainly aware of these pieces of legislation, aware of the potential that their local authority can be preempted to some degree. We are in the process of working with localities to develop policies or regulations that we've had to have conversations about whether or not we're working on something that would need to be changed or could be moot altogether. Certainly with this legislation that was being advanced in this session, but next year, if the table bills come back. And so that always kind of presents a question that's hard for us to answer, hard for no one can answer. No one knows what the legislature would ultimately do. A lot of localities, if these bills were adopted, certainly a lot of localities, the regulations that we're aware of locally and policies would certainly need to evaluate and reevaluate those. So I don't know that we've heard this from a locality, but it would perhaps be good to have some compliance period. If the legislature was intent on adopting these, then giving localities some period of time to get ordinances and regulations, updated to be consistent with this legislation would be really important. Especially if localities don't have the option of imposing a moratorium to allow for that to occur. And my experience in some other states is that there are often, especially with preemption bills of this type, effective dates set out, 6 years to a year later to allow for localities to get things in order in that way. And I would tell you March or April until July 1 doesn't provide that sufficient amount of time for that to occur if we're going to go with something as sweeping as this. But beyond that, I can imagine that most of our localities would like to ensure that the status quo is maintained, that they have their local authority to regulate this land use and other land uses consistent with local decision making and local policy. I think that does, and again, we strongly encourage localities to set out clear and objective policies and regulations and criteria for these facilities. And we always would recommend that that's a best practice. But I do believe to a degree that localities should have the autonomy to decide whether or not this use is or is not appropriate for their locality, where they are allowed, by zoning district, the design of them and the size and scale of them. And I think most of our localities that we work with would echo those same expectations.
Great, thank you. Well, I think this concludes the second part. I'm looking forward to our third and final part of this webinar series, which is the future energy landscape of Virginia. And I think we can be as creative as we want in our crystal ball. So thank you.
Great, thank you.